So EA's Star Wars Battlefront Open Beta was recently released, and so I had the opportunity to play it to my heart's content to be able to get a general feel for the game. And since the original Star Wars Battlefront games were such a prominent part of my childhood, I thought I'd give my thoughts on the overall affair. Most of the time I spent playing the beta was spent on the PC. However, the footage I've recorded is all from the PlayStation, as the last time I tried recording footage of a new game on my PC during beta was Titanfall, and it was somewhat neutered as an experience when trying to compensate for the extra requirements for running recording software at the same time as the game. So, with that out of the way, let's get started at looking into EA's Star Wars Battlefront. There's no getting around it. The game looks and sounds gorgeous, if nothing else. There's been so much focus on getting the look and sound of the game down that they've definitely managed to convince me that my surroundings are those of a galaxy far, far away. The overheating system. I was somewhat skeptical of this approach at first, as even though some weapons in Battlefront 2 would overheat instead of having ammunition, not all of them did. I am, however, pleased to say that the overheating for the most part works well, with weapons generating heat and cooling down at different rates, and there's an active reload implemented that has the reload zones get smaller after each successful active reload, making it useful in a tight firefight, but not as an alternative to fire control all the time. I'm also quite happy with the vehicles we had access to, with possible exception to the AT-AT. The controls were simple enough to pick up easily, and I must admit the game felt closest to the classic Battlefront games whilst in a vehicle, although I still haven't managed to get to grips with air-to-land combat yet. The AT-ST also feels appropriately like a tank, without feeling impenetrable. The cycler rifle does a fair bit of damage against them, it would seem. I didn't get much of a chance to play as the hero, with most of my games ending shortly after or being in such a winning position that I didn't get a chance to use the hero effectively. But from what I could tell from fighting against them, it very much comes down to how well the person plays the hero. A good hero can do a lot of damage to both players and in and out of vehicles, whilst a bad hero is just going to get themselves shot up, because a good flank from regular soldiers or a direct hit from an AT-ST could easily deal a lot of damage to a hero, bringing them down without much of a fight. Being able to switch from first to third person at will is great, and I didn't feel that there was much of an advantage for having one viewer over the other, with the possible exception of some shots from third person hitting barriers because of the positioning of the character to the crosshair, but that's to be expected. Both vehicles and hero power-ups were dropped at semi-random spawn locations, which appear suitably to deal with players trying to camp them. However, most of the other power-ups are underwhelming, and don't feel worthwhile of being something that has to be picked up, with exception to the orbital strike. I wouldn't mind the other abilities being star cards, with significantly longer recharge times to those that we saw in the beta. On smaller game modes like Drop Pod, the short recharge time on the thermal detonator made it a spam fest. This may be rectified later on with a full game if there's enough decent star cards to make it so thermal detonators don't see as frequent play. But I'd argue that if not, we'd need to see changes in the recharge times of star cards for balancing purposes in different game types. Mission mode was incredibly dull, with stormtroopers who could somehow miss repeatedly at point-blank range. The variety of stormtroopers was a good touch, but it doesn't do anything particularly interesting outside of being another Horde-style game. Spawn points are somewhat schizophrenic. Many a time on Walker Assault, the rebels would be spawning right on top of the Empire, and sometimes there'd be drop pods that would almost be fully captured before you even had a chance to get to them, for the spawn point was so far away. I figure that this is because, due to the enemy being in a high concentration on top of the drop pod, it spawns you to a location that's safe, which, whilst it is good for not having you spawn on top of the enemy, it can be problematic when you've got such a great distance between you and the objective. There were only a couple of bugs that I noticed particularly during my playtime, and all of them were related to vehicle pickups. What would normally happen would I'd either pick up my power up and use it, at which point it would cut me straight back to where I was originally without giving me my vehicle, or other times where my vehicle just seemed to disappear with absolutely no feedback as to why it had disappeared. Neither of these was particularly game-breaking, but it was annoying when you have a vehicle pickup that gets wasted by it just disappearing. There were some things which seemed a little bit off balance-wise. Whilst it wasn't impossible, nor particularly hard for the Rebellion to win on Walker Assault, and it makes sense that in this situation the Empire should have the overall advantage, in terms of gameplay I feel that the Empire has slightly too much of an advantage, and most of the games would end up with the Rebellion being crushed without a single AT-AT taking more than 25% damage.
The power generator is about to sustain heavy damage. Stop that walker.
Focus fire on that walk.
Whilst the weapons mostly tended to come down to personal preference, I found that the DLT-19 seemed to be the most dominant by far, with having a high fire rate, a long time before overheating and decent damage, with the only major drawback being shorter zoom range, which in the long run wasn't much of a disadvantage. This is another thing that may change with the inclusion of more weapons, and the DLT-19 did cost more in terms of credits and did require the higher level to unlock. There were two major things which grabbed my attention as interesting features that weren't actually in the beta, and those were the character customization and the battles mode. Character customization in itself is interesting as it adds diversity to characters you encounter in the game, and I've always enjoyed having that option in other multiplayer games such as the Halo franchise. The battle mode itself is also described as allowing you to battle friends or the AI, something which would add a lot more to Battlefront in terms of longevity, in my honest opinion. Whilst this is far from the Battlefront game I've been waiting for, nor would I consider it a worthy successor to the classic Battlefront games, I cannot deny that it did enjoy it for the most part as its own experience, and much like Battlefield Hardline before it, it looks to me as though the game would have probably done better had it not had the name attached to a larger franchise in order to boost sale numbers. The game itself is probably something I will pick up at one point, but definitely not for full retail price, especially considering that there's also going to be a season pass attached to it as well, which will have to be picked up to get all of the features that they're going to add later down the line. It isn't a terrible game in any sense of the word. At worst I'd say it's mediocre, though I feel that it's got quite a bit more to it than just mediocrity. It's just overshadowed by having to live up to the expectations of being a Battlefront game, a series with some incredibly good gameplay, and when you look at the alpha footage from the cancelled Battlefront 3, which was designed for the last generation of consoles, and then compare it to this, it makes the game look a lot more lacking, despite the amazing visuals. And as for my take on this being Battlefield with a Star Wars skin, I disagree. In fact, I feel in an attempt to distance Battlefront from Battlefield, they've ended up making a Star Wars shooter which feels even less like Battlefront than it would had it been Battlefield with a Star Wars skin. So those are my opinions on EA's Star Wars Battlefront. I do honestly hope that when the game comes out it will have a lot more than I saw in the beta and will as such blow me out of the water. In working condition, of course. And as such will offer enough for me to feel like it's a worthwhile purchase. However, for the meantime, I'm going to have to leave it. Do you have any other thoughts or experiences on the Battlefront from the beta, or feel like I missed something? Please leave a comment. I'll be happy to discuss them with you. Otherwise, I'll see you all next time.